Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment.
Former President Donald Trump acquitted in his second impeachment trial. Senate Democrats failed to flip enough Republicans to secure the 2/3 vote needed. The final vote was 57 to 43. In a surprising about-face, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell berated the former president just minutes after voting to acquit him.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president.
Well, despite his sentiments, McConnell said he ultimately could not vote to convict Trump because he is constitutionally not eligible for conviction because he is no longer president. The acquittal now makes Mr. Trump eligible to run for office again, and we will have more on this story tonight on Nightly News.